Hey guys, my name is Max and welcome to Simple Biology. In this video we're going to start talking about cellular respiration. And in fact, there are actually three main parts of cellular respiration that we're going to break this into. So this video will only cover glycolysis. Now glycolysis is the first part of respiration, but make sure and go watch our other videos in order to get the more full understanding. Now glycolysis gets its name from splitting sugar. So glyco for sugar, lysis to split or break. So glycolysis is basically the initial step of splitting glucose, splitting that sugar into smaller pieces that then the cell can use for later steps in respiration. So obviously glycolysis has to occur in order for respiration to work, and since that's where a cell gets its energy, glycolysis is a very important process. Now first we're going to have to go back and review some chemistry. So there is a certain type of reaction called a redox reaction. This is essentially a reaction in which electrons are moved around between different compounds in that reaction. So the name redox comes from two different types of reactions: re from reduction, and then the RED is actually from reduction, whereas OX is from oxidation. So reduction, oxidation. And oxidation is basically when electrons are lost from a certain compound or element. And so in this example equation, you can see you have sodium metal reacting with water to form sodium hydroxide and hydrogen gas. So I've kind of also shown a generic formula, and so sodium metal will actually have one more electron than the sodium ion that you'll see in sodium hydroxide. So it actually lost an electron during the course of this reaction. The sodium metal lost an electron in order to form the ion. Since this is an ionic compound, the sodium will actually have a +1 charge. And now reduction is the opposite of that. It's when something gains electrons. In this example, it was the hydrogen in this, and since hydrogen was bonded to oxygen, we take it as if the hydrogen had actually lost an electron to the oxygen, so the hydrogen would actually have a +1 charge in this example. And this comes from the fact that the electrons will be much closer to oxygen than to the hydrogen. If you need a review of how that works, go check out our chemistry review videos. They have a lot of good stuff about water and how it has those polar bonds. But anyway, this hydrogen will actually gain an electron in order to form hydrogen gas, where both of the hydrogens will actually share the electrons equally. So it'll be like they gained an electron during the course of this reaction. So those hydrogens were reduced. Now some other examples of redox reactions include anything that rusts, so like iron or even silver, and anything that burns, so maybe methane when you light your stove, or glucose for that matter. It can burn too. But the point of a redox reaction is essentially to allow electrons to fall to a lower potential energy. And this is why a lot of redox reactions will actually release heat as those electrons fall. Now, but what can we do with that heat? That's in respiration, we always want to get the energy and use it for something else. That's the point of respiration. So you can kind of see from these two diagrams, there's kind of two different ways that you can get the energy from glucose. You can either do it all at once. Glucose can burn, releasing large amounts of energy at once. You can do it all at once, as shown in this diagram. You kind of got potential energy versus, I guess, time. And so the glucose is just burning or exploding or something, and the electrons are going straight from glucose to oxygen, releasing a bunch of energy. Or you can do it in steps, and as it goes through each step, a small amount of energy is given off, but that energy can be more readily accumulated. It can be transferred and stored in different ways. And so as it gradually gets to lower and lower potential energy, eventually reaching oxygen, that energy is done in small enough pieces that it can be used in like a better way than to just burn glucose. So this is what will happen in your cell. You'll have the glucose, and then electrons will be transferred to something slightly more electronegative, and it'll go down those steps until you get to oxygen. Now, there's a very important enzyme that helps with this energy conversion, and it's called dehydrogenase. Essentially what it does is it takes off two hydrogen atoms from from some molecule along the way, and while doing so, it'll also take 2 electrons. So it'll transfer these electrons to certain electron carriers that we'll talk about, and it'll give those electrons to those electron carriers, and when it does that, it'll do one of these steps. So one of these very important electron carriers is actually NAD+. And NAD+, essentially, it'll gain 2 electrons and a hydrogen and become NADH, and it'll transfer these electrons to what's known as the electron transport chain. Don't worry about the electron transport chain right now. We'll be talking about that in a later video, so go check that out. But all you really need to know is that NAD+ is used to transfer those electrons to that later step. So next we're going to give just kind of an overview of what happens in glycolysis. Now you can kind of see from this diagram here all the different major steps. The first phase that we're going to talk about of glycolysis is what we call energy investment. So what will happen is 2 ATP for every glucose will be used in order to phosphorylate the glucose, and this will give us ADP as kind of a product. And then the glucose that has these phosphates will actually split into 2, and we'll go into this next phase called energy payoff, where 4 ATP are then actually gained. And so you'll notice that you're getting more ATP than you put in. Since there's a net gain of 2 ATP, this is why glycolysis actually provides energy for the cell. And this formation of ATP is known as substrate level phosphorylation. Don't worry about that word, but know that it exists, and substrate level phosphorylation occurs during glycolysis. And that's the gain of ATP more than what we put in. Now, also in the energy payoff phase, you see that we actually have this NAD+, which is reduced to give us NADH. And when this happens, this NADH can then be used in the electron transport chain, like we mentioned earlier. And so that will actually be a source of energy when we go later on. Now, kind of as a whole, uses 2 ATP, gains 4 ATP, gains 2 NADH, and you end up with 2 pyruvate and 2 water instead of glucose. And also, I should mention this, but glycolysis actually all occurs in the cytosol. Now, you're probably saying, wait, what about the mitochondria? I thought that's where respiration happened. Well, actually, the mitochondria is where a later stage of respiration is going to happen that we'll talk about in our next video. But glycolysis all occurs in the cytosol. And it actually occurs in bacteria too, which don't even have mitochondria. So that's why glycolysis is such an important process in biology. Now, one last thing that you should recognize is that there is no oxygen involved in glycolysis. It doesn't take any oxygen. So it's known as an anaerobic phase of respiration, whereas the later steps that we're going to be talking about will actually use oxygen. And so that's where we talk about aerobic respiration.